This is currently the world's most powerful memory chip that IT has a storage capacity of 48 gigabits and a maximum transfer rate of 2 terabytes per second. That means in just 1 second, it can process more than 400 high-definition movies, each over 5 gigabytes in size. Because the data processing demands of artificial intelligence are exploding at a staggering rate. This high-bandwidth memory chip, along with Nvidia's computing cards, has become standard equipment in supercomputing data centers, with major tech companies scrambling to outbid each other for supply. Since April this year, memory prices have surged by more than 300%. In this wave of price hikes, South Korea has emerged as the biggest winner, because over 70% of the global memory market is monopolized by South Korean companies, especially in the field of high-bandwidth memory, or HBM. South Korea holds absolute dominance at the same time. Memory is a core pillar of South Korea's economy. In 2024, semiconductor exports accounted for 31% of South Korea's total exports, and the semiconductor industry made up 12% of its GDP, of which over 65% came from memory chips. The South Korean stock market has also repeatedly hit new highs. From April this year to now, the Kospi index has surged from just over 2,000 points to more than 4,000 points, nearly doubling. You might be wondering, how did a small country like South Korea come to monopolize the global memory industry? Hello everyone, I'm Moyu. In this video, let me break down exactly how South Korea transformed itself from a small agricultural nation into a world-class semiconductor powerhouse. From having nothing to dominating the globe, what opportunities did South Korea seize along the way? And what can we learn from its story? I went through a mountain of research and condensed and refined it into this 20-minute video, hoping to help you understand it all in one go, with ease. If you find this helpful, please hit like and drop a coin to support me. Moyu. Thank you. In the 1950s, Western media called South Korea the country with the least promising future in the world. The nation was resource-poor, utterly destitute, and more than half of its population struggled with food shortages at that time. South Korea's per capita GDP was just over $60, roughly one-quarter that of North Korea. But you would hardly believe that just over 40 years later, South Korea had stepped into the ranks of developed countries. Today, South Korea's per capita GDP is 30 times that of North Korea, and its total GDP is more than 50 times larger. What on earth happened in between? What twists of fate allowed South Korea to reverse its destiny? In 1948, the United States and the Soviet Union divided the Korean peninsula along the 38th parallel, creating two separate nations. The North sided with the Soviet Union, while the South followed the United States. From the very beginning, the South's economy lagged far behind the North's. Resource distribution on the Korean peninsula was extremely uneven. The North had broad plains, fertile river basins, and abundant reserves of coal, iron ore, and forests, all the materials needed for industrialization, concentrated in the North. Meanwhile, the South was mostly mountainous, with scarce mineral resources and insufficient arable land, lacking the basic conditions for both agriculture and industry. On top of that, massive industrial and transportation infrastructure had been destroyed during the war, and the electricity supply had been cut off by the North. After the war, industrial production in the South was utterly paralyzed, and its grain, textiles, industrial raw materials, and capital were all completely dependent on American aid. At this point, South Korea's start could be described as catastrophic. Forget about making chips. South Koreans couldn't even reliably put food on the table. So, given such desperate conditions, how did South Korea break through and eventually become a semiconductor superpower? Neighboring Japan provided a blueprint. Japan, like South Korea, was also a resource-poor nation whose economy had been devastated after World War II. Yet in the 1950s, Japan staged a miraculous recovery. The key was becoming a manufacturing subcontractor for the United States. During the Korean War, the U.S. turned Japan into its rear base in Asia, shipping massive amounts of military supplies there for processing, providing production lines, capital, and technology, and reviving local employment. South Korean leaders realized that for a country with scarce resources, insufficient capital, backward technology, and a tiny domestic market, developing an internally driven, self-sufficient economy was totally unrealistic. South Korea's one and only advantage was its extremely cheap labor. So, emulating Japan and becoming America's subcontractor was the best possible way forward at the time. It would solve the employment problem while bringing an advanced industry. In 1961, Park Chung-hee came to power and launched the first five-year plan, putting all efforts into developing export-oriented industries. At the same time, the government passed the Foreign Capital Inducement Act, allowing foreign capital to set up wholly owned enterprises in the country, with numerous tax, customs, and loan incentives. Just at this moment, it happened that during the 1960s, American workers' wages were sky-high. To cut costs, U.S. semiconductor firms began looking to expand overseas, keeping the high value-added chip design at home while shifting manufacturing and assembly to other countries. South Korea's labor costs were just 1/10 of those in the U.S., and its political environment was very friendly toward America, so South Korea became an ideal destination for investment by numerous U.S. manufacturers. In 1962, Fairchild Semiconductor set up a packaging and testing plant in Incheon, South Korea. Soon after, Texas Instruments, Philips, Motorola, and other famous names all invested and built factories in South Korea. In 1965, South Korea and Japan formally established diplomatic ties. And Japanese semiconductor leaders Toshiba and Hitachi also began building assembly and testing plants in South Korea. The American and Japanese companies that arrived during this period essentially helped South Korea build a complete semiconductor industry from scratch. First, there was no available workforce, because 80% of South Koreans were still farming at the time, so systematic training was needed. The American and Japanese firms provided systematic training for South Korean workers, covering everything from basic assemblado equipment operation protocols and semiconductor knowledge. Second, they built an advanced production system to ensure consistent product quality. The foreign firms directly transferred standardized production processes to South Korea, setting up everything from lean manufacturing to assembly line operations. Third, they spurred industrial ecosystem development. A factory alone wasn't enough. You also needed upstream raw materials and equipment, and downstream shipping and export support services. This forced local supply chains in South Korea to upgrade. By the 1970s, South Korea had already formed an electronics industry cluster centered on the Gumi Industrial Complex, covering semiconductor packaging and electronic component production. This was the earliest seed of South Korea's semiconductor industry, laying the foundation for the country's later decision to pursue the electronics sector. Entering the 1970s, South Korea's GDP soared, with growth rates exceeding 20%, a period we know as the miracle on the Han River. Per capita GDP had already reached over $250, gradually catching up with North Korea. And the problems of employment and basic survival had improved dramatically at this point. Some South Koreans began to feel dissatisfied with just doing basic assembly and processing. A model built purely on sweatshop labor had no future, so they began searching for more valuable business opportunities. And right on cue, the biggest wave of opportunity in the world arrived. In 1970, Intel invented the world's first DRAM memory chip with a capacity of 1 kilobit, that is, 1,000 bits, priced at $10. This was a revolutionary product. Before this chip was introduced, the world's dominant form of memory was magnetic core memory, which was bulky, expensive to build, and extremely power-hungry. Intel managed to integrate complex circuits onto a tiny silicon chip, dramatically shrinking size, power consumption, and cost. In 1971, Intel launched the world's first microprocessor chip, the 4004. Just a few tiny chips could replace an entire room of mainframe hardware. And the era of the microcomputer began. US tech companies poured in investment, constantly developing more advanced chips. Japan launched its VLSI project, uniting Toshiba, Hitachi, NEC, and others to concentrate on breaking through DRAM memory technology. And in South Korea, the tycoon among tycoons, Samsung founder Lee Byung-chull, also set his sights on the opportunities in the chip industry. Lee Byung-chull was a man with a strong appetite for risk, a trait you'll come to recognize repeatedly as this story unfolds. In 1938, Samsung was just a small trading company, mainly selling vegetables, dried fish, and noodles, exporting them to Northeast China. After the Korean War, due to severe domestic shortages, Lee keenly spotted an opportunity and went on to establish a sugar refinery, a textile mill, and a fertilizer plant. His businesses grew bigger and bigger during the post-war reconstruction, eventually expanding into finance and real estate by the 1960s. As Japanese semiconductor firms entered the country, Samsung partnered with Japan's Sanyo to produce black and white televisions. This was the starting point for Samsung's eventual dominance in the global TV panel market. By the 1970s, Lee turned his attention to semiconductors at that time. Another major South Korean tycoon, Hyundai founder Chung Ji-young, had multiple conversations with Lee. Lee said he wanted to go into the semiconductor business, but Chung was more bullish on cars and shipbuilding. That he believed that developing chips was an extremely risky decision. In South Korea, there were virtually no local engineers who understood chips. All materials and equipment were completely dependent on imports, and semiconductor manufacturing was a classic asset-heavy industry that required massive amounts of capital. On top of that, this was an emerging industry, and even the US and Japan were still in the early stages of chip R&D. It was very likely to be a long-term money-burning endeavor with no financial return in sight. But Lee was firm in his choice to pursue chips. At that time, the world's most advanced memory chips had already reached a capacity of 64 kilobits, and Lee was determined to develop South Korea's own 64K chip. He adopted very aggressive methods to achieve this goal. The first was a frenzy of spending. In 1975, Samsung acquired South Korea's first wafer fabrication plant, Hankook Semiconductor, and renamed it Samsung Semiconductor. In 1978, Samsung bought a subsidiary of Fairchild Semiconductor and purchased semiconductor process technology licenses from Sharp, Micron, and others. Then, with salaries 5 times the going rate, he poached engineers and technical staff from foreign firms like Texas Instruments, Sharp, and Toshiba to form his technical team. The second method was deploying a classic South Korean tactic, stealing technology. Samsung bought up massive numbers of memory chips from overseas semiconductor companies and conducted reverse engineering and teardown analysis. But some critical processes were too complex, and foreign firms enforced strict technology blockades, making it impossible to crack even through reverse engineering. So they sent technical personnel to Japan and the US to infiltrate semiconductor companies and steal the technology. Some were even caught red-handed and kicked out of the premises. The third method was intense motivational brainwashing and all-out willpower training. Employees in Samsung's semiconductor division worked up to 90 hours a week. Some were denied leave even to visit their newborn children. That a member of the development team later recalled that because of the relentless hours and immense psychological pressure, many people's health broke down. Some passed out or became delirious while at work. Finally, in 1983, after 8 years of all-or-nothing investment and grueling round-the-clock effort, Samsung successfully developed its 64-kilobit DRAM. This was a milestone moment in South Korean semiconductor history. Before this, South Korea had only done simple assembly and processing, but this time, it entered the international market under its own brand. Seeing Samsung's success, the other conglomerates followed suit. In 1982, Hyundai launched its semiconductor project, bringing in an R&D team from Silicon Valley and hiring a large number of Korean-American engineers. Shortly after, Gold Star, the predecessor of LG Group, also jumped into semiconductor investment. The South Korean government seized the moment, launching the Semiconductor Industry Promotion Plan that same year, pouring $346 million in policy loans into the semiconductor sector and catalyzing over $2 billion in private investment. But to be fair, in the early 1980s, South Korea's chips still didn't have a real seat at the table. In 1982, the global mainstream memory capacity had already reached 256 kilobits, while Samsung didn't develop its 64K chip until 1983, and Hyundai only managed it in 1985 that time. The memory market was still dominated by the US and Japan, and South Korean brands held less than 5%. But an incredible windfall was just around the corner. In the 1980s, the United States was steadily losing its chip war with Japan. In 1981, Japan's NEC was the first to complete the development of 256K DRAM. From then on, the latest generation of memory chips was always spearheaded by Japanese companies. Even worse, because Japan had cheaper labor and domestically developed equipment and materials, it had an absolute cost advantage. An American firm sold a memory chip for $4. The Japanese would say, "I'll sell it for $2. Their selling price was lower than your production cost, and they still made a profit. How could you possibly compete? From 1980 to 1986, the Japanese slashed memory chip prices to 1/3 of their original level. Due to continuous losses, Intel was forced to lay off over 7,000 employees in 1985 and drastically scale back its DRAM business. Texas Instruments shut down its DRAM factories in 1986. The U.S. semiconductor market share shrank from 60% to around 40%. While Japan's share surpassed 50%, seizing the title of global semiconductor hegemon. The Americans had originally helped develop Japan's electronics industry because they wanted a cheap manufacturing base. But they hadn't expected that once that subcontractor learned the technology, it would use its cost advantage to turn around and stab them in the back. How could they accept that? So, in 1985, the US and Japan signed the Plaza Accord, causing the yen to appreciate sharply against the dollar, and weakening Japan's cost advantage. In 1986, the US launched an anti-dumping investigation against Japanese chips, and the two countries signed the US-Japan Semiconductor Agreement, which imposed quotas on Japanese chip exports. In 1987, the US announced punitive tariffs of 100% on Japanese electronics imports. Under these successive blows, Japan's semiconductor industry was devastated, sinking into a long decline, and its global market share fell year after year. So, who picked up Japan's huge market share? South Korea, of course. By that time, South Korean companies had just fully mastered DRAM R&D and production technology and had successfully developed the 64K DRAM. As the US kicked Japan to the curb, it needed to cultivate the next source of cheap labor, and South Korea became the ideal choice. From 1983 to 1986, the US provided technical support, market access concessions, and talent assistance to South Korea, using South Korea's growth to suppress Japan. South Korea itself kept rolling out policies to boost investment in its semiconductor industry. In 1980, South Korea's semiconductor R&D investment was about $8.5 million. By 1994, it had reached $900 million, an investment increase of roughly 100 times. With this torrent of money, the scale of South Korea's semiconductor industry expanded rapidly, and it built up a vast patent portfolio. At the end of 1989, South Korea had only 708 semiconductor-related patents. By 1994, that number had risen to over 3,000. Moreover, South Korea placed enormous emphasis on talent cultivation, spearheaded by the government. An alliance of conglomerates like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai joined forces with 6 of South Korea's top universities to form a government-industry academia consortium, specifically training semiconductor talent and jointly tackling the latest DRAM technology. From this point on, South Korea's chip R&D capabilities made staggering progress. In 1986, it developed a 1 megabit DRAM, trailing the latest generation from the US and Japan by about a year. In 1992, South Korea's 64 megabit DRAM was successfully developed and launched simultaneously with chips from the US and Japan. In 1994, South Korea globally debuted the 256 megabit DRAM, and in 1995, it was the first to develop a 1 gigabit memory chip. In roughly 10 years, South Korea narrowed its gap with the US and Japan, and eventually surpassed them. At the same time, its semiconductor market share grew higher and higher, and it gradually became the world's second largest semiconductor manufacturer. Back then, Japan was mired in the agony of its burst bubble economy, while South Korea was jubilantly seizing Japan's lost market share along with massive orders from the US, achieving an economic liftoff. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, South Korea's GDP growth stayed above 10%. In 1996, its per capita GDP exceeded $10,000, formally propelling it into the ranks of developed nations. To a certain degree, we can say South Korea rose on the back of Japan's decline, that Japan's lost 3 decades where South Korea's gained 3 decades. But at this point, South Korea was still just an appendage to U.S. chipmakers, holding a market share of only around 20% in memory. To go from a follower to a monopolist of the global memory market and become a true semiconductor superpower, it would still need to make 2 bold, high-stakes gambles, as we mentioned earlier. Samsung founder Lee Byung-chull was a man with a strong appetite for risk, even verging on recklessness and a gambler's madness. His personality profoundly shaped Samsung's corporate DNA. In multiple crises that followed, Samsung chose radical gambles every time, and fate was extremely kind to Samsung, allowing it to win them all. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis erupted, and demand for electronic products quickly wilted. Meanwhile, in the preceding years, global semiconductor investment had been so aggressive that the industry was already suffering from severe overcapacity and massive inventory backlogs. The price of a single DRAM chip plummeted from $16 to $4, a quarter of its original price, yet still couldn't be cleared out at fire sale prices. Moreover, all the investments chipmakers had made during the industry upswing became heavy burdens during the downturn. Factories and equipment required maintenance and depreciation, bank loans required interest payments, and workers' wages still had to be paid. These were all relentless costs. This crisis triggered a total reshuffling of the global memory industry. In 1996, Japan's largest memory company, NEC, posted a loss of $1.2 billion and laid off 20,000 workers. Intel lost more than $2 billion, laid off 15,000 people, and ultimately shut down all its DRAM factories in 1998. In 1998, Texas Instruments sold its memory business to Micron Technology, exiting the DRAM market. In 1999, IBM sold its memory business to Toshiba, also exiting the memory market. Toshiba held on for 2 more years, but couldn't endure it any longer and quit in 2002. Other major players like Motorola, Hitachi, and Fujitsu, unable to bear the burden, either cut production or withdrew entirely. However, one company was exceptionally stubborn. Not only did it not pull out, it chose to expand aggressively against the tide. From 1996 to 1999, Samsung invested $1.2 billion to build 4 new semiconductor plants in South Korea, boosting its DRAM production capacity from 100,000 wafers a month to 300,000. Of course, this wasn't so much counter-cyclical investment as it was that the worsening of the industry down cycle was closely tied to Samsung's actions. Did Samsung lose money doing this? Of course it did. At the time, DRAM prices had fallen below the cost of production. They lost money on every wafer they sold, racking up annual losses of over $400 million. Yet Samsung kept running its factories at full capacity. At the same time, South Korea's share of the global semiconductor market steadily climbed, rising from 20% to 40% over a few years. That Samsung's intention was quite clear. It wanted to add fuel to the fire just as the other players couldn't hold on any longer, squeezing its competitors to death and seizing their market share. But this was an enormously risky move, because no one knew how long the industry downturn would last. And on top of that, the Asian financial crisis meant the business environment was unstable. If the company ran out of money and couldn't survive the trough, bankruptcy and collapse were all that awaited Samsung. But Samsung deliberately chose to gamble, lose, and it would go bankrupt, win, and once the industry recovered, all its rivals would be dead, leaving it as the sole dominant force free to gorge on the industry's spoils. And as luck would have it, the gamble paid off. Entering the 21st century, the internet age arrived, and demand for memory chips from personal computers and servers surged. The global memory market rebounded. Meanwhile, in 2002, China joined the WTO, opening up the world's largest semiconductor consumer market to trade. Samsung came back to life. From 2000 to 2007, the global memory market tripled in size, and Samsung Electronics emerged from years of consecutive losses. Its net profit swung from negative 61 billion Korean won in 1997 to over 1 trillion won in 2007. Then, when the 2008 global financial crisis struck, the memory industry once again faced a devastating blow, and Samsung, sticking to the same playbook, chose to gamble yet again. In 2008, Samsung announced it would spend 118% of its total profit from the previous year entirely on expanding its DRAM production capacity. The memory market was already in oversupply, and Samsung's expansion made it even worse. The price of a 1 GB DRAM chip crashed from $2.4 to $0.8, and 512 megabit chips even fell below $0.3, plummeting straight through the cost of raw materials. In 2009, German manufacturer Qimonda declared bankruptcy, officially marking the exit of European players from the DRAM market. In 2012, Japanese manufacturer Elpida went bankrupt, and Japan's players fully exited the DRAM market. And once again, Samsung's bet caught a glimmer of dawn. In 2010, the iPhone 4 burst onto the scene, ushering in the mobile internet era. As demand for memory from smartphones and tablets exploded, the entire industry recovered once more. Samsung feasted on the dividends of the mobile internet age, its performance rapidly rebounding from the trough and tripling in a short period. By 2017, Samsung's revenue reached $69.7 billion, surpassing Intel's $62.7 billion, the title of the world's biggest semiconductor company, held by Intel for 25 consecutive years, was passed to Samsung. In 2022, Samsung Electronics posted revenue of $245 billion, eclipsing Microsoft's $198 billion. You can't help but marvel at Samsung's gambling luck. The semiconductor manufacturing industry is distinctly cyclical, yet at the bottom of every cycle, a new wave of the times arrives to rescue it. After the 1997 Asian financial crisis, came the personal computer and internet wave. After the 2008 financial crisis, came the smartphone and mobile internet wave. In 2019, just as smartphones and PCs seemed to be entering a saturated market and the pandemic added further pressure, keeping the memory industry in a slump, suddenly, the AI boom arrived. After several rounds of massive industry consolidation, the number of global memory chip makers shrank from over 20 in the 1980s down to just 3. There was one other South Korean manufacturer and one American manufacturer. In 1999, South Korea's Hyundai and LG Group, two major conglomerates, chose to join forces. They merged and restructured their semiconductor divisions and renamed the company Hynix. Later, Hynix was acquired by another conglomerate, SK Group, and renamed SK Hynix. It is now the world's second largest memory chip maker and fourth largest chip maker overall. America's Micron Technology, on the other hand, used each cyclical downturn to acquire the memory businesses of Toshiba, NEC, Texas Instruments, IBM, and others at low cost. After surviving each trough, it too fully enjoyed the spoils of the industry's recovery. And so, the memory market settled into a tripod of Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, which together command more than 90% of the global market share. With the explosion in AI demand, high bandwidth memory, HBM, is in such short supply this year that it's almost impossible to get it. On November 5th, SK Hynix notified Nvidia that the price of its next-generation HBM would rise by 50%. Keep in mind, Nvidia is the darling of the AI era, the world's undisputed tech leader. But Jensen Huang not only agreed to the price hike, he even bought up all of SK Hynix's production capacity for next year on the spot. Orders for 2026 have already been sold out in advance. Meanwhile, Samsung is also adding fuel to the fire. On November 14th, according to sources familiar with the matter, Samsung is preparing to further raise memory chip prices. With a 60% hike compared to September, AS memory chip prices surge. Samsung and SK Hynix's earnings have skyrocketed. Samsung Electronics stock price nearly doubled within half a year, pushing its market cap to $450 billion, while SK Hynix's market cap multiplied by 2.5 times. One would think that with memory companies at their peak, South Koreans should be overjoyed. Instead, they are growing increasingly anxious, because beneath the prosperity lie hidden concerns. In the first half of this year, semiconductors accounted for 35% of South Korea's total exports, with memory making up over 60% of that. The memory industry has become South Korea's absolute economic pillar. But this isn't necessarily a good thing. It means South Korea's industrial structure is overly singular, and its national fate is tightly bound to the semiconductor cycle. Any slight turbulence in the semiconductor industry could deal a severe blow to the country. Japan has announced restrictions on exporting key materials for semiconductor manufacturing to South Korea. Keep in mind, Japan is the world's largest supplier of semiconductor materials. It accounts for 90% of global production of hydrogen fluoride used in making display panels, and 70% of the photoresists required for lithography. With these restrictions, Japan had South Korea by the throat, and material industries require decades of accumulated experience and process know-how, making domestic substitution impossible in the short term. Another threat comes from the United States. In March 2024, the Biden administration demanded that South Korea proactively tighten its exports and technology transfers to China. China is South Korea's largest export destination, at one point taking over 40% of its semiconductor exports. Under the impact of U.S. demands, in the first quarter of 2025, South Korea's semiconductor exports to China dropped 23.5% year-on-year, with memory chips plunging by over 40%. Losing its biggest buyer has left South Korea crying foul. Beyond that, China is also a vital production base for South Korean chip companies. 40% of Samsung's NAND chips are produced at its plant in Xi'an, China, and nearly half of SK Hynix's DRAM chips are made at its Wuxi plant in China. Because EUV lithography machines cannot be introduced into China, Samsung and SK Hynix must complete front-end processing in China, then ship the wafers back to South Korea for EUV lithography, and then send them back to China again for packaging, a process that inflates production costs dramatically. Over the past 2 years, talk of a semiconductor crisis has been unrelenting in South Korea. South Koreans have realized that on the surface, They are the world's second largest semiconductor manufacturing nation, but in essence, they are still the same subcontractor they were decades ago. The upstream core raw materials and equipment are in other people's hands, and core products of the computing power era, like GPUs and CPUs, are not South Korea's strong suit. South Korea cannot rely solely on memory that IT needs to diversify its chip industry and achieve independent control over critical materials and equipment. In August 2019, the South Korean government announced measures to strengthen the competitiveness of materials, components, and equipment. In May 2021, it unveiled the K-Semiconductor Belt Strategy, committing a total investment of $450 billion over the next 10 years to build the world's largest semiconductor cluster near Seoul. In 2023, the government launched this Semiconductor Ecosystem Support Plan, investing $259 billion in the chip industry over the next 5 years, with a goal of achieving 50% domestic production of critical materials, components, and equipment for the chip industry by 2030. Through 2024 and into 2025, South Korea has continued to double down on semiconductor projects, constantly increasing investment. The anxiety in South Korea is palpable. Semiconductors are distinctly cyclical, and South Korea cannot simply bet its national destiny on every downturn. Before the next cycle trough arrives, it must transform its fragile industrial structure. Since 2018, the global trade landscape has undergone dramatic shifts, and South Korea must navigate a path between the grinding competition of the US and China. Although South Korea has gradually grown from a small agricultural nation into a developed country, the fundamental nature of being a subcontractor hasn't changed. Its industrial structure is singular, and its dependence on external forces is too high, making it highly vulnerable to shocks in the global division of labor. In fact, whether we look at Japan or South Korea, the essence of their rapid economic development was driven by the division of labor in the global industrial chain, as the United States sought lower costs and outsourced its manufacturing capacity. Their rise and fall are intimately tied to the rise and fall of the chain leader. If that leader declines or simply becomes unhappy, then a small country in a dependent relationship will suffer a severe blow. Today, China is the world's largest semiconductor market and a critical link in the global industrial chain's division of labor. China, just like South Korea in the past, currently faces a gap of several generations between its industrial technology and the most advanced products of developed countries. China, just like South Korea today, also faces the chokehold problem of materials and equipment. IT is imperative for China to accelerate the realization of full, autonomous, and controllable industrial chains covering materials, equipment, and design at the same time. South Korea's success was no accident. It was the result of strong government support, long-term investment by the conglomerates, and the convergence of historical opportunities. Today, our own country's policies support corporate R&D investment, and with AI demand exploding, we also face a critical window of opportunity. In the latest draft proposals for the 15th five-year plan, our country has placed the chip industry at the very top, announcing that it will adopt extraordinary measures to push forward breakthroughs in core integrated circuit technologies across the entire chain, aiming for game-changing results. I believe that the rise of China's chip industry is an inevitable outcome, and it's already not far from us. That wraps up everything for this video. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. If you found this helpful, Please like, follow, and support me. I'll be bringing you many more valuable insights.